Welcome everyone to the summer semester of the Institute for Learning and Retirement. We have some great courses this summer. I hope you've signed up for a few of them. In any case, you're attending the first session of what we call the Summer Wonders. In other words, classes that don't necessarily have a common theme among each other, but each one is quite interesting. And today we have a presentation by one of our stalwarts, Roy Hunt, who's been with ILR for so long it's hard to remember, and presents a real diversity of courses. So today he's giving what we call one-shot, dealing with the ill-kept secrets of Charleston Farmhouse, the Bloomsbury Group at Work and Play. And we're going to need to start recording. So let me see if I can do that. It already is. Okay, super. Okay, so Roy, go ahead. Thank you.
Right. Well, I've done a lot of lectures or presentations at ILR. You can't hear?
Might be a little closer to you. Yeah.
Can you hear now? Okay. Well, I've done a lot of presentations over the years, but I think this is my favorite so far in terms of the research. And it's a rather long title, but I think you'll understand why as I go along. My entire professional career was in the law world, the law school world, but I majored in English literature at Vanderbilt in the early 1950s. I attended Vanderbilt on a Navy scholarship, which meant that my summers were spent at sea with Naval Academy midshipmen. And my English lit major and my summer cruises intersected as I had the opportunity to visit the homes of writers and poets I was studying. And this was an experience which has personalized these literary figures for me in a way that simply reading never could be. And my very first of these visits was in Scotland. And in 1952, my destroyer, the USS Weeks, DD-701, docked in Greenock, a port near the mouth of the Firth of Clyde, which is really a suburb of Glasgow. And not far to the south, along Scotland's west coast, lies the small village of Ayr, or the small village of Alloway near the small town of Ayr in Ayrshire. And here Robert Burns was born in 1759 in a small cottage on Alloway High Street, a shrine to Burns today, and he lived here for his first 7 years. And across the high street are the ruins of the old kirk featured in Tam O'Shanter's Ride. A short distance away is the Brigadoon, a late medieval bridge which was immortalized by Burns, and later, I guess, on Broadway. Well, seeing the box bed in which Burns was born in the cottage where the Burns family lived, and visiting nearby sites which inspired his poetry, began a 70-year history of my visits to literary shrines and a greater understanding of the writers and poets who made them home. And 3 years after my first visit to Scotland in 1952, this time as a freshly minted ensign, naval officer, junior officer in the USS Wisconsin, one of 4 battleships of that class, I encountered the second of Scotland's triad of the greatest authors, Robert Louis Stevenson. Our battleship was tied up at Hawes Pier, almost under the great Firth Forth Railroad Bridge. In fact, the rail bridge became a World Heritage Site in 2015, the 125th anniversary of its opening. And near our ship, facing the pier, was the Hawes Inn, a coaching inn dating from 1793, and today part of a small group of boutique hotels and inns in Scotland. Well, the Hawes Inn quickly became an informal officers' club during our Edinburgh stay. And Robert Louis Stevenson was staying at the Hawes Inn in 1886, in room 13 to be precise, when he came up with the idea for Kidnapped. And he wrote the first half of Kidnapped in this inn. Then during the same stay in Scotland, I made a pilgrimage south to the Scottish borders and Sir Walter Scott's baronial mansion, Abbotsford, on the River Tweed near Melrose. Here was the seat of the third member of the Scottish Triad. My tour guide of Abbotsford in 1955 was one of Scott's two great-great-great-granddaughters, who jointly or together, the two owned Scott's mansion and had made it into one of Scotland's premier tourist attractions. Well, I've been back twice. I've returned to Abbotsford twice over the years, but my lasting memories of that first visit in 1955 are Sir Walter's spectacular library and the statue of his favorite dog, Maida, outside the entry, and Maida is buried underneath. Well, until I began preparing for this talk, I'd not realized how much my major in English literature at Vanderbilt had influenced or guided my past 70 years of travel. Preparation for this talk has triggered so many memories of so many visits to the homes of the giants of English literature. And in fact, it occurred to me that I could have titled this plagiarizing Wordsworth's preface to his lyrical ballads. You recall the phrase, emotions recollected in tranquility. Well, that's kind of what this talk is. And preparation has also triggered a search through a lifetime of photo albums for some of my favorite, often quirky sites visited. And I want to share just a few before we arrive at Charleston Farmhouse, the quirkiest of them all, and where life was harmoniously chaotic, filled with art, friends, and flowers. And I'm going to start with the English Lake District. Here, the home of the 19th century group known as the Lake Poets, most notably Wordsworth and Coleridge. The Lake District provides an embarrassment of riches with respect to literary shrines, including Wordsworth's birthplace in Cockermouth, as well as the 4 homes in which he subsequently lived in the Lake District. And of these, Dove Cottage is clearly the most evocative. Built in the early 1600s as a Grasmere public house on the route between Keswick and Windermere, it served that purpose until 1793. And then in 1799, Wordsworth and his friend and neighbor Coleridge were out walking and happened upon it, and Coleridge rented it in 1799 as a home for himself and his sister Dorothy. In 1802, Wordsworth's bride Mary moved in along with her sister. And then 3 children arrived in short order over the next 4 years. And then Thomas de Quincey became a permanent guest in the house, which was already, of course, bulging. This is a very small cottage. And in fact, de Quincey remained there as a longtime renter when the other household members moved on to larger quarters in nearby Grasmere. And it was in Dove Cottage that De Quincey wrote his widely read Confessions of an English Opium Eater. And in fact, near neighbor Coleridge was addicted to opium, and Wordsworth's sister Dorothy took it for years for her migraine headaches. Well, when I first visited Dove Cottage, and I think that was probably 1970, I was mystified, and I remain mystified at how this large group of people survived. The house had no indoor plumbing, and of course, no indoor toilet. Well, only a few miles south of Dove Cottage, near Hawkshead, is another literary shrine. Now, this is another 17th century vernacular stone farmhouse, but it was bought in 1905 by Beatrix Potter, author of the illustrator of The Tale of Peter Rabbit, which was first published in 1901. It did extremely well, and it provided the money with which she bought this cottage. Well, she died here at Hilltop House in 1943, leaving her home and the entire contents to the British National Trust. A visit there today is like a visit with Beatrix Potter, an author who was so loved in Japan that Hilltop House has been replicated in a Japanese park. Well, moving over a bit to Ireland and William Butler Yeats, really the quintessential poet and leader of the Celtic revival. In 1916, Yeats bought this 15th century Anglo-Norman tower house near Gort in County Galway. And after restoration, the Yeats family lived here year-round from 1921 to 1929, later used it as a summer house. Its romantic setting on the Streamton River is absolutely enchanting. The views of the water from the lower floors never cease to inspire Yeats. This was the view from his library or office in the tower looking directly at the Streamton. Then moving quite a way back to England and up to Yorkshire, the parsonage, the home of the Bronte sisters, the little town actually, Haworth. Of course, they never pronounce anything the way that it's spelled. But the home of the three Bronte sisters, their widowed father, and their alcoholic brother, Branwell. Well, I was with a group of friends, several who live at Oak Hammock on this particular morning, and we had to walk through the moorlands in this pretty dense fog to get to the house, which made it all much more romantic. And then visiting the bedrooms of each of the three sisters was a special treat. And of course, they were amazing. Charlotte wrote Jane Eyre, Emily wrote Wuthering Heights, and Anne wrote The Tenant of Windfell Hall. And each published under a male pseudonym. And each died young, as did Brother Branwell, officially of TB, although recent research suggests a contributing factor, and this is horrible, was graveyard water from the graveyard set on a hill right in front of the parsonage and filtered into house water supply, causing the early deaths of many of house inhabitants. This is the graveyard that produced the graveyard water. Skipping around again, I picked Dylan Thomas's boathouse in Loch Arn in Carmarthenshire, Wales. Here, my companion and I were joined only by the boathouse's resident cat as we sat in the living room listening to Thomas's 1952 recording of A Child's Christmas in Wales. which emerged from an earlier piece he wrote for BBC Radio. Before leaving the Thomas property, we hiked uphill to above the boathouse to what he called his writing shed, where he worked and surely was inspired by the view of 3 estuaries below. Perhaps my favorite of all of these visits, other than the final one, Charleston Farmhouse, was a visit to T.E. Lawrence's tiny cottage called Clouds Hill in Dorset. Many of you probably have read a great deal about Lawrence, but Lowell Thomas made Lawrence of Arabia a household name with his 1922 publication of the book With Lawrence in Arabia, 4 years before publication of Lawrence's own autobiographical The 7 Pillars of Wisdom, which was immediately recognized as a literary masterpiece. Both books provide extraordinary accounts of the 1914 to 1918 Arab Revolt and Lawrence's role in it. Most of us are old enough to remember the epic historical film that was Lawrence of Arabia, and which first appeared in 1962, and in 1963 won both Oscars for the Best Picture and the Best Director. Well, the script was based on Lawrence's 7 Pillars of Wisdom, and after seeing the film, I read both Lowell Thomas's book and Lawrence's own autobiographical The 7 Pillars of Wisdom. And this inspired more research that led me to view Lawrence as one of the most complex and tragic men of the 20th century. However, none of my research provided the insight into Lawrence's character provided by my visit to Clouds Hill, again, this tiny isolated cottage in the heart of Dorset, to which he retreated after he left public life in 1922. He was able to lease this little house with 4 acres in 1923, and then was able to purchase it in 1925. And he left public life because he was so embittered by his country's betrayal of the Arabs in the 1916 secret agreement between England and France, which divided up Arabia after World War I. In fact, he was so embittered that he declined King George V's offer of a knighthood in 1918. Well, 2 friends and I visited at Clouds Hill on Easter Sunday morning in 2001, and except for the National Trust steward who admitted us to the house, we were alone throughout our visit. Though there were only 4 small rooms in the cottage, each revealed Lawrence's personality, in large part because everything was as if Lawrence had just walked out, perhaps for toileting. Why this cottage has such historical integrity is part of Lawrence's tragic story. Lawrence was a huge fan of speed, airplanes, but also motorcycles, which he rode. And on a morning in 1935, he was riding on a local road, rural road near Clouds Hill, when he topped a hill and saw 2 young men on bicycles directly ahead. Well, he swerved to avoid them, lost control, flew over his handlebars, and died 6 days later. A brother who inherited Clouds Hill donated the cottage and everything in it to Britain's National Trust. Well, forced to single out one of the 4 rooms for detailed description, I chose the 2nd floor guest room, which Lawrence often called the eating room, and sometimes the bunk room. Well, distinctly quirky, Lawrence wanted the room to resemble a boat, so he inserted a porthole in the wall and built a cabin bunk bed for guests with drawers underneath to provide storage, which of course you see here. But he lined the room first with asbestos, and then that was overlaid with aluminum foil to keep out the damp and provide insulation, but he wanted to make it look like the interior of a ship's cabin. Well, there was no kitchen in the cottage, and he kept his food in a corner of the guest room and in huge quantities because he believed in buying in bulk. Well, perishables such as cheese and nuts were kept under these large glass domes. But the thing that's etched in my memory, but it doesn't show up in this photo, are stacks of cans of Heinz baked beans with toast made over the fire next door in the music room fireplace. Lawrence and the celebrity guest who slept in this bed, including George Bernard Shaw, E.M. Forster, and Robert Graves, were just a few. Well, they can enjoy their peculiar British treat of baked beans on toast. As well as no kitchen, there was no loo, and guests were given a spade and told to go outside somewhere on the 4 acres not visible from the house. Overnight guests were provided a red cotton, and this doesn't look very red, it's very dull here, so it's faded over the years, but they were provided a red cotton sleeping bag to put on the bunk bed, and on it was stitched tuum, yours in Latin. Lawrence slept downstairs in what he called the book room on a 6-foot square Arabian divan in a brown cotton sleeping bag on which was stitched meum, for mine in Latin. Well, emerging into the Easter sunlight, I felt Lawrence's deep affection for this place, and I also felt I'd been given some further insight into this difficult and tragic author. Well, again, skipping around, this time to Hampshire and Jane Austen. My last Yale study tour focused on Jane Austen and Thomas Hardy shortly before COVID shut down these tours. And over a 2-week period in which we visited every site associated with the two authors and their books, the single most evocative moment for me was seeing Jane Austen's small round writing table in her bedroom at the cottage in Chawton, where she spent the last 8 years of her life. Well, in 2011, my literary pilgrimages took on a more organized form, a succession of Yale study tours led by Yale faculty specializing in English literature. And these small group experiences were complete with assigned readings from the authors whose homes we were to visit. And of all of the days on 3 different Yale study tours, Saturday, May the 28th, 2011 stands out from all the rest. This is the day I first discovered Charleston Farmhouse. Early in the day, I had experienced the magic of Bateman's, the home Rudyard Kipling and his American wife Caroline bought in 1902, 6 years after their 4 years in Vermont, during which he wrote the hugely successful Jungle Books and Captains Courageous. Well, Bateman's was the Kipling home from 1902 until 1931, bought for its privacy in deepest Sussex. Originally, it was built in 1634 by a local ironmaster, and this sandstone manor just suited the Kiplings perfectly, who were seeking privacy. And coincidentally, Kipling loved antique iron firebacks made from the local iron, as evidenced by several scattered throughout the house. And for those of you who know Henry Mercer in Dawestown, Pennsylvania, and the Mercer Mile, this, of course, was a passion of Mercer's as well. And his Mercer Museum is filled with Moravian iron firebacks. Well, at Kipling's Bateman, I was particularly intrigued by the apparent lack of a system for shelving the books in his huge library. But in addition to antique iron firebacks, Kipling had a passion for automobiles, and his 1928 Phantom II Rolls-Royce still sits in Bateman's garage. Well, after a plowman's lunch at the 400-year-old The Griffin Inn in Fletching, we were off to Furl and the ill-kept secrets of Charleston farmhouse. When our small van first approached this nondescript farmhouse, I asked myself how it could loom so large in the history of the Bloomsbury Group, and just who was or were the Bloomsbury Group. Well, one could not have majored in English literature at Vanderbilt in the 50s and not know something about the Bloomsbury Group. But my experience today is that they're not very well known. Well, of the group's 10 core members, 5 were writers you likely would have encountered, if not actually read: Virginia Woolf, E.M. Forster, John Maynard Keynes, Lytton Strachey, and Roger Fry. These 5 writers, including the most important economist of the 20th century, were part of an informal network of writers, artists, and art critics who lived in the central district of London near the British Museum, known as Bloomsbury, famous for its 16 residential squares, each surrounding a fenced and gated garden for the private use of the residents. Well, the principal artists in the group, Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant, likely, incidentally, this is as you pass through the gate and turn left to go in the door here, the front door. This is your view of the pond, which the children used as a lake, swimming, sailing boats, things that children would like to do. Well, the principal artists in the group were Vanessa Bell and Duncan Grant. They're less likely to be familiar to you than the writers. And Roger Fry, who I mentioned as the 5th of the writers, was also an artist and an art critic. And Roger Fry was known for having organized the first exhibition of French painting, Impressionist painting, in London in 1911. In fact, he gave it that name, Impressionism. He did a second exhibit a year or so later, introducing French Impressionism to the British. This is Vanessa Bell. This is a self-portrait. I was fortunate in running into a special exhibition of her work in the Dulwich Gallery in London just a few years ago. And of her self-portraits, this was my favorite. This is one of her paintings. She was very much influenced for her first 10 years of painting by the French Impressionists, and particularly Monet. And this is her version of haystacks. You may recall that Monet did, you may not know how many, but he did 31 haystacks over time. And in fact, he did 25 over late summer 1890 into the early spring. So she was certainly influenced by Monet. I don't think this looks like Monet at all, but I do think it's charming, and she had her own skills. So anyway, I was able to see about 30 or 40 of her paintings. Then this is Duncan Grant, who I'll be talking a lot about. He was the one member of the group who was brought in really he's the one male who had not attended Cambridge, but was introduced by Lytton Strachey's cousin. In fact, she was also a cousin of Duncan Grant. And some years later, 25 years later, in fact, he did his own haystack. So haystacks were a big thing in those days. And if you've been to the Harn, as I'm sure you have, and if you've noticed the painting next to our own Monet, Theodore Robinson did haystack as well. And Theodore Robinson had actually moved to, an American Impressionist had moved to France and spent 4 years next door to Monet and painted with him. So it's not surprising to have all these haystacks. Well, even though not so familiar to the general public, I think it was Vanessa Bell. I think it was Vanessa Bell who was the glue that held the Bloomsbury group together for so many years. All the core members, except Duncan Grant, met at Cambridge, as I think I mentioned, either at Trinity or King's. And except for Vanessa, members of the group were openly bisexual. A bit surprising in view of the then recent 1895 conviction of and imprisonment of Oscar Wilde for homosexual relations under British criminal law not repealed until 1967. Ironically, Virginia Woolf, who had a notoriously torrid or passionate affair with Vita Sackville West, the wife of Sir Harold Nicholson, in the 1920s, had no worries in this regard since there was no equivalent legislation that targeted gay women. The first meetings of the Bloomsbury group occurred in 1905 in this house, the home of sisters Vanessa and Virginia Stephen, before their marriages, Vanessa to Clive Bell in 1907 and Virginia to Leonard Woolf in 1912. These meetings were here in this townhouse overlooking the garden in Gordon Square, and Lytton Strachey lived very nearby at number 56. And as a matter of, I think, interest, John Maynard Keynes later acquired this building, number 46, and it was his London home from 1916 until his death in 1946. He actually died at his country house near Charleston Farmhouse, Tilton House, but again, this was his city home for decades. Well, the subsequent sexual histories of the group led American wit Dorothy Parker to describe members as, quote, living in squares and loving in triangles, unquote. Well, the group's iconoclasm was the crucible of the group. They were rebelling against their parents and against all things Victorian. Well, it's almost time to focus on Charleston Farmhouse as a work of art, on the people who lived there and the complex and shifting relationships of the Bloomsbury group. But first, it's necessary to understand why this particular property became ground zero for the Bloomsbury group for so many years, for 30 years. Again, the building is nothing special architecturally, nor is the landscape. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of similar vernacular structures in Britain. It was the outbreak of World War I that begins Charleston Farmhouse's special niche in the history of Bloomsbury literary and art. This world-shaking event determined Vanessa Bell to find a way to keep the man she loved, not her husband, as a matter of fact. And she had, well, more about them later. But she wanted to keep the man she loved, Duncan Grant, the artist we just saw, from dying in the trenches of France and out of prison. This man was fellow artist Duncan Grant, who had registered as a conscientious objector. And in England, during World War I at least, men had to fight or to farm or to go to prison if a conscientious objector who was not a farmer. So Vanessa sought her sister Virginia Woolf's help in finding a farm and farmhouse that she might lease and where Duncan Grant could labor as a farmer. Well, in 1916, Virginia found Charleston Farmhouse for Vanessa, located near the village of Firle in Sussex and only a few miles from Virginia and Leonard Woolf's own country house. She was able to rent for more, or lease this house for more than 60 years from the Firle estate. And many years later, Vanessa's younger son, Quentin Bell, described the arrival at Charleston Farmhouse. One dark October afternoon in 1916, Mr. Sutton's aged but capacious taxi arrived at Charleston carrying Vanessa, Julian, Quentin's older brother, and at that time, Julian was 9, Quentin was 6, a cook, Mr. Grant, Mr. Garnett, a nursemaid, a nurse, and Henry, who was the dog. No Mr. Bell, however, for by that time, Clive's marriage to Vanessa was one in name only, although they never divorced and always were companionable. Well, at this point, you should be asking or wondering, well, who is Mr. Garnett? Well, Mr. Garnett, nicknamed Bunny, was Duncan Grant's lover and also a registered conscientious objector. Well, although Vanessa Bell loved Duncan and likely had become infatuated with him years earlier upon first meeting him in 1905 when Pippa Strachey introduced him to the Bloomsbury Group, and before she married Clive Bell in 1907, and later served with him on the board of the Omega Workshop in London, which was a group of 3 founded by Roger Fry, and they produced so-called modern furniture, textiles, and so on. The problem is that while she loved Duncan, Duncan preferred men. And one of these men was John Maynard Keynes. The two of them had met in the summer of 1908, and although their sexual relationship lasted a relatively short time, the friendship continued. And as I say, by 1914, Duncan Grant had a new companion, Bunny Garnett. Amazing to me at least, but typical of members of the Bloomsbury Group, the end of the affair was without any rancor, and Keynes joined the Charleston household during World War I, and this was the room that John Maynard Keynes had at Charleston Farmhouse throughout World War I and for some years after. So, I mean, this was a house full of very talented people of various tastes. Well, in 1921, Keynes discovered he loved women, and in 1921, he wrote he had fallen very much in love, quote, with Lydia Lopakova, a Russian ballerina with Diaghilev's Ballet Russe, which was at that time performing in London. And in 1925, Keynes married Lopakova with his former lover, Duncan Grant, as his best man. Telling you, these people were before their time. And not only that, in 1937, Keynes made a substantial settlement on Grant, thus supporting the artist for the rest of his long life. He lived to be 93. So with his marriage, Keynes and his bride were exiled from Charleston farmhouse, but Keynes bought Tilton House nearby, and he and Lydia lived happily ever after. And again, he died at Tilton House in 1946. Well, the relationship of Duncan and Bunny lasted for 7 years, 1914 to 1921, but we've not seen the last of Bunny. At the end of World War I, Charleston Farmhouse became a summer house during the years between the two world wars. And though Duncan often strayed from Vanessa, she never stopped loving Duncan, and he always returned. He apparently needed the stability that she provided, and in reality, she was the enabler of his lifetime of homosexual affairs. She apparently could not live without him. And finally, in the spring of 1918, she succeeded in seducing him. And 9 months later, on Christmas Day, their daughter Angelica was born at Charleston Farmhouse. And Clive Bell obligingly acknowledged her as his child. At the time, Bunny Garnett was there, and shortly after Angelica's birth, wrote to a friend, quote, "I think of marrying it." Now, why he said it, I don't know, but this is the quote. "I think of marrying it. When she will be 20, I shall be 46. Will it be scandalous?" Well, yes, it was, but not for that particular reason. In 1921, after leaving Duncan, Bunny also found heterosexual love, marrying Rachel Marshall, becoming a successful author, and buying a country house near St. Ives. In 1938, while his wife Rachel was dying of cancer, Bunny began an affair with Angelica Bell. And Angelica reports that she lost her virginity to Bunny Garnett in H.G. Wells' spare bedroom. Only a few months earlier, her mother, Vanessa, had informed her that she was really Duncan Grant's daughter and not Clive Bell's daughter. Well, Rachel died in 1940, Bunny's wife, and Bunny and Angelica married in 1942 to the horror of her parents. Angelica had unknowingly married her father's lover of 7 years, a fact she learned only later after she and Bunny had 4 daughters of their own. The Garnetts separated in 1967. Well, Roger Fry, one of the founders and important members who coined the term post-impressionism for recent developments in French art, and who was the figure to raise public awareness of modern art in England, was the first member of the group to die in 1934. This was a major blow to the entire group, but particularly to Vanessa, who had once been and remained a close friend, and for a couple of years had been his lover. And in 1917, Fry had designed for Vanessa the walled garden, and which we still see today. This is a particularly dramatic view as the storm is approaching, a view I took recently. And if you look at the upper story, you see the 5 windows in a row. That was added by Vanessa later as her studio, much later. And then I couldn't resist throwing in a Stattle stone that's in the garden, because every arts and crafts house has an obligatory Stattle stone. And here is how Stattle stones were originally used. This is from a cottage ornate in a different part of England, but they originally were used to keep rats out of the corn crib or what have you. But again, every garden had to have one. As I say, Fry's death seemed to be the death knell for Charleston Farmhouse as ground zero for the Bloomsbury Group. But this was not to be. History intervened. And on September the 3rd, 1939, England declared war on Germany. And even before the German Blitz in London began a year later and lasted until May 1941, Charleston Farmhouse had again become the year-round home of Vanessa, Duncan, two of the children. Vanessa and Clive's older son, Julian, had been killed in the Spanish Civil War in 1937. But World War II at Charleston Farmhouse saw the permanent residence of Clive Bell. He was the husband who spent World War I with his mistress in a different country house, but now in World War II, he is, I guess, returned to the fold. He became a permanent resident of Charleston Farmhouse. And during the years of World War I, Clive was, I've already mentioned that during World War I, he occasionally visited with his mistress, but spent the war at the home of Lady Ottilie Morrell. By contrast, when the Charlestonians prepared to face the rigors of World War II, Clive brought his furniture and other belongings, including his bedroom carpet, from 50 Gordon Square in Bloomsbury to Charleston Farmhouse. According to his son, Quentin, Clive was petulant about his accommodations, and Vanessa responded by refurbishing the whole of the north end of the upstairs, providing Clive with his own self-contained flat. This is Clive's study, and this is a fabric which is still being produced that was designed for the Omega workshop by Vanessa and Duncan. That ingenious fireplace was designed by Roger Fry. The stenciling is that done by Vanessa and Duncan, or perhaps one of the children. In any event, Clinton later wrote, ours was an elastic home. It never broke. Clive, Duncan, and Vanessa lived on good terms, and it is to the credit of both my parents that they remained amicable for the 50 years of their married life. Well, let's see what this next one is. This, Duncan and Vanessa continued to live together at Charleston Farmhouse until her death in 1961. And Duncan continued to live there almost until the end of his long life, dying at the home of a former lover in 1978 at the age of 93. Well, after Duncan's death, Angelica moved back into this house in which she was born. And although she subsequently moved to France and died in Aix-en-Provence in 2012 at age 93, and she was the last direct link to the Bloomsbury Group, but she was active in the efforts that saw Charleston restored and opened to the public in 1986. And fortunately, the group set up to save the house was able to acquire title from the Farrell estate, which Vanessa had never been able to do. Well, you now know the cast of characters who made Charleston Farmhouse so special. And I earlier described the exterior of Charleston Farmhouse as nondescript. The house's interior is anything but nondescript. It reflects the work of both Vanessa and Duncan, the designs and colors changing with their enthusiasms, and experiments of those with the many other artists who visited, sometimes lived, and worked there. I believe shabby chic was invented at Charleston Farmhouse. Furniture, some painted, some plain, some little better than firewood, some of rare and amazing quality. added to the visual richness of the place. Heirlooms were happily mixed with pieces brought from local junk shops. This happens to be Vanessa's bedroom, screen she designed. This is her writing desk in her bedroom, and certainly the desk is a beautiful piece. The fabric on that chair is another Omega Workshop design, as are the drapes or curtains behind. This is the green bath. This was added when Clive moved down. And as you can see, they painted almost every surface. Here's a close-up of the side of the bathtub. Here's the dining room, and this is one of my favorite rooms. And the lamp, I don't think I have a close-up of it, but the hanging lamp is one designed by Quentin, the son, one of the sons, who was a potter. And it's pierced so that light shows through the sides of it. But as World War II was breaking out, Duncan and Quentin, in order to have something to do, decided to stencil the dining room walls. So this interesting pattern, which they did, stems from about 1940, 41. Another side of the dining room shows the fireplace. Again, this was quite an old building, and this is original to the house. But most remarkable of the things for many visitors to the house are the textiles. And the most remarkable of the textiles is the needlepoint. Cushion covers, frames for mirrors, and all sorts of rugs, fire screens, wall hangings, and stools and chair covers. So for those of you who are interested in textiles and needlepoint, someone recently loaned me a book of the needlepoint, and these are photographs of that needlepoint. This is probably my favorite on a daybed. Here it is laid out. So this is where fine art and applied art most nearly met. And it's a good place to end this story of Charleston Farmhouse. Again, of all the literary shrines I visited over the years, and I have visited well over 100, maybe 150, both in the United States and abroad, Charleston Farmhouse remains my favorite. And I don't travel anymore, but maybe some of you still travel. And if you do, I urge you to make a pilgrimage to Charleston Farmhouse. Thank you. Any questions? Do any of you remember that Virginia Woolf died by suicide? If you do, one of the things that I read, which I had never known before, and I just read this about a month ago, is that she had every reason to be depressed. She had fits of depression throughout her life, but as World War II broke out, and she and her husband, of course, had the cottage down near just about 6 miles from the sea, from the English Channel, she learned that Hitler had a list put together of 2,300 residents of Britain who were to be immediately imprisoned when Germany invaded England. And both she and her husband was Jewish, she was not, but they were both on that list. And this, she learned shortly before she filled her overcoat pockets with stones and walked into the Ouse River adjoining the property and killed herself. So that's kind of a sad end to my lecture, but I do think it's, I'd never known about that list of Hitlers before, and it's pretty stunning. Okay, any questions?
Thank you so much, Roy. We do have a question from online, and that's from Shelley. Could you go ahead?
Hey, Roy, that was absolutely fabulous. Thank you for doing all that. I want to go back to what you were talking about with Doug Cottage
Yeah,
and Thomas Quincy.
yeah.
Was he related to the Adams family, John Quincy Adams?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay.
And of
Okay.
course, he was a little D.E., Quincy. But anyway, to my knowledge, he was not. I've never read that. I did
I'm
read
not-
Confessions of an English Opium Eater as part of my English Lit course, but no mention was made of that.
I'm not familiar with what he wrote. He was a writer, right?
Yes, and
Thomas Quincy.
it was considered a major literary contribution, that book, Confessions of an English Opium Eater.
Oh, okay. I guess I missed that in my lifetime.
Well,
Okay, here's my second
went
question.
To school a number of years after I did, so probably it had been forgotten by then.
Here's my next question. Did you have beans on toast?
Absolutely, and I happen to like it.
What kind of beans do they're not American pork and beans?
And I think they're British because the British have been eating those baked beans on toast forever. And you know, if you get an English breakfast, they always have a helping of those beans.
Well, I'll have to try it. Thank you.
Well, you may not like them, so.
Oh, I bet I would. Thank you, Roy. I like you.
Questions? Online or here in Okamic?
Well, I've exhausted you. Thank you for being here.
And thank you for a wonderful presentation.
Right, stop this. Well, then, yeah, it might be turned down. Lou. Yeah, I noticed that. Looks like I might have gotten dropped. Who knows?